Hey everybody, this is Adrian Johnson with another installment of the Process Vlog. Today I'm going to be focusing on inking with the nib. I came back from the art supply store after getting a couple of new nibs and a new nib holder. And usually the first thing I do when I get a nib holder or really a new pencil or anything like that is that I wrap it with masking tape. And what this does for me is that, it kind of prevents hand fatigue because you will be holding that particular tool for, hours on end. So, you might as well get comfortable. It's almost like being a boxer. You know how a boxer has to wrap up their hands before the big fight? Kind of similar, except your knuckles aren't scraped and swollen at the end of the night, hopefully. So yeah, I got my nib holder wrapped up here, a few layers of masking tape. Looks nice and firm, so I think we're good to go with that. Now, this is the Hunt 102 nib. I've grown accustomed to the 102. I know when I first started trying to ink with a nib, I thought it was very, very stiff because I had been primarily a brush inker for about maybe five or 7 years prior to getting used to it. And so when I do get a new nib, the first thing I do is burn off the sheen of oil that comes on it. You'll notice that those nibs will be very shiny. And what that is, that's a type of oil that comes on the nibs from the factory. And the best way I found is to burn it off with a lit match, or you can use one of those grill fire starters, with the trigger. And so we got it ready to go. And what that does, I should mention too, is that when you burn off that oil, it tempers the nib and it's ready for inking. Because if you don't, I found that if you don't burn off that oil, the ink, as you start trying to work with it, will bead up on the nib, and you definitely don't want that, because if it beads up on the nib, it could drop down onto the actual board at the most inopportune time. So you definitely want to avoid that, obviously. And so what I'm doing here is I usually start to break in the nib by just focusing in on certain line weights, thin lines mostly, because if you go in too firm off the bat, I find that it dulls the nib unnecessarily. So I kind of just go in and just start with just light line work, again, just to break in the nib. And what I'm doing also, in addition to that, is that I'm kind of thinking about the rest of the page, how I'm going to attack it. Because with this smaller nib, with the 102, I prefer to use that for kind of tighter lines, smaller line work. And so I may not necessarily want to use that 102 for the rest of this particular image. At least I know definitely I'll be using this on the female's face here. And so I'm just kind of hopping around, just checking everything out, and kind of making a game plan in my head as far as what part to attack next, and just keeping it very fluid. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of just going in and starting to detail some of her braid texture on her locks. That's definitely something that, irks me in terms of, when, people draw, ethnic hairstyles, paying attention more to the texture of the hair. And I realize that everyone has, a different style and approach, so they try to render hair or whatever type of material in their particular style. I know for myself, I kind of there's no kind of, I definitely, work to take pride in, rendering, the different texture, just as a black artist myself. And when it comes to, trying to represent, black hairstyles and so forth, really taking the extra mile to get in there and, taking account of, really making it, stand out, because that's something that I notice when I read, comics or look at illustration. It's kind of the verisimilitude of the illustration. Like, even though we're dealing with the subject matter that is, fantastical, you do have to ground it in elements that can be recognized by the audience. And so having the character, have a recognizable hairstyle or some type of texture, that's something that, grounds the piece and, helps the relatability of the reader to that particular image. Okay, you saw just at that brief moment where the film slowed down there. You saw me kind of pick off the point of the nib. Now that's one of the cons, I would say, in terms of the 102 and really nibs in general. But particularly with the 102 nib, you'll find that as you use it, you'll definitely have to keep that point kind of clear, because the point of the nib is very sharp, and so you'll find as you're working with it, it gets very cluttered with excess paper, because really what the nib is doing is digging into the paper to leave a groove, depending on how even how light you may apply the nib. It's still leaving a groove in the paper to filled for the ink to fill into that groove. So there's that. And so you definitely want to make sure that you're keeping that point clear, or what'll happen is, and here's something that you can actually use to your advantage, which is what I'm doing here. If you notice that there's like a little piece of paper starting to accumulate on a point, you can actually use that on the fly as a makeshift kind of a nib. Well, not a nib, kind of a felt tip, so to speak. A makeshift felt tip. And the good thing about that is that with the paper on the point of that nib like that, you can actually use that to fill in certain black areas. You can kind of use it as almost like a marker, because the paper that's on the tip of that nib right there, really allows you to fill in an area more quicker, much more quickly rather, than just trying to use just the bare point of the nib. So while I have that paper accumulated on the tip of the nib, I'm just going in and filling in some blacks that I know are going to be solid blacks, and kind of getting that out of the way. And so as I start filling in those solid blacks with a big field of ink, the piece starts to come together, and I can kind of see, okay, where I need to balance my blacks at. And the main thing, especially when you're working with comic style illustration or comic books themselves, you have to be mindful of where your blacks are spotted, because depending on how they're spotted, that can affect the strength of the line work. And there I am picking the paper off again, because I want to go ahead and get back to the bare point, because I'm going to have to do some thin line work again now instead of the thick. But back to what I was saying, in terms of spotting those blacks is what it's called. Once you start seeing those solid blacks come together, you can really start to see the piece or the page or the image, really form, and that will inform what you do for the rest of the line work. And so what I'm doing here is kind of just going in between the locks here, in between the braids. And this is a technique. You might notice that I'm putting solid black in between the braids, but in some of the areas there's kind of like a perimeter of white space around it. For those of you that don't know, this is actually a technique in inking called haloing. And it's just as it sounds. You're putting a halo around a certain area. And so when I first started doing inking, for myself, and I would see it in actual comic books, I thought it was just a stylistic thing. I was like, oh, that looks really cool. That looks really cool. But little did I know until I started doing it myself, and I would read up on it, that's actually something practical that inkers and comic book artists do to separate certain planes, certain areas, from one another. Particularly if you're working on two things or things that are close in proximity that are both black. Using haloing, just separates those two things as two different objects, because otherwise, unless it's something that you intend to do, they can kind of run together, and I definitely don't want that. I definitely didn't want that. I wanted them to appear as two separate things. All right, and so at the end of this session, like with all my sessions, I take my pinpoint and just put it in a cup filled just barely with glass cleaner, just a regular run-of-the-mill glass cleaner. Helps break down the ink that is sitting on the nib. I usually leave it overnight, or also I'll dip it in there as I'm inking just to keep it broke down, and just take a rag and just wipe it off. So when we're ready to go again, take it out, rub it with the rag.